There's a meme that circulates online every few weeks. Someone posts their packed calendar, their 5 a.m. wake up, their 16-hour workday, and captions it something like "rest is for the weak" or "sleep when you're dead." And you scroll past it, maybe even relate to it a little, because that's the air we breathe. Productivity is the currency, busyness is the proof of value. But here's what's quietly remarkable. The one word in the entire Bible that God uses to describe a day he personally inhabits, the one day he blesses and sets apart in the very first chapter of the story, is a word built on the concept of stopping. The Hebrew word is Shabbat. It means to cease, to halt, not to worship more intensely, not to switch tasks, but to stop. And the God who spoke galaxies into existence stopped. Which raises a question that doesn't go away easily. If he stopped, what exactly are we proving by never doing the same? The most common response to a conversation about Sabbath goes something like this: "That's an Old Testament command. We're not under the law anymore. We're under grace. And you understand the instinct. The New Testament is full of warnings against returning to the law as a means of salvation. Paul himself is emphatic about it. So the reasoning feels sound. Sabbath belongs to a different era, a different covenant, a different people. But here's what that argument quietly skips over. The Sabbath doesn't begin at Sinai. It doesn't begin with Moses, or the Ten Commandments, or the formation of Israel as a nation. It begins at the very first week of creation, before any law was given, before any people existed to receive one. Genesis 2:2-3 records it plainly. God finished his work on the seventh day and he rested. He blessed that day and made it holy. Not because he was exhausted. God doesn't grow tired. He rested because the work was complete, and he marked that completion by stopping and dwelling in it. This is a crucial distinction. The Sabbath was woven into the fabric of creation itself, not added later as a religious requirement for a specific ethnic group. It's part of the structure of time, the rhythm God established before human history had properly begun. When Exodus 20 arrives, when God speaks the Ten Commandments at Sinai, the fourth commandment doesn't create the Sabbath, it recalls it. The precise word God uses is remember. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. Exodus 28, that word matters. You can only remember something that already exists. The Israelites weren't being introduced to a new concept. They were being called back to an original one. The Hebrew word itself carries this. Shabbat, the root of the English word Sabbath, means simply to cease, to stop, to halt. It doesn't primarily mean to worship or to attend a service or to perform a ritual. It means to put down what you are doing and rest in the fact that it is finished. The cessation is the point. So when someone says Sabbath is a Jewish law that doesn't apply to us, they're answering a question that's slightly smaller than the one the Bible is actually asking. The question isn't whether we're bound to the Mosaic legal code. The question is whether we're willing to honor a rhythm God built into creation long before there was a legal code of any kind. One is a question about religious obligation. The other is a question about whether we trust the way God designed the world to work. This distinction changes everything about how you approach the conversation. Sabbath isn't primarily a rule to evaluate, it's a design to consider. And if the design predates the law, then dismissing it as part of the law misses its deepest roots entirely, which raises the obvious next question. If Sabbath is a creation rhythm and not merely a Mosaic regulation, what exactly was it designed to do? What was it meant to produce in the people who practiced it? For that answer, you have to leave the mountain at Sinai and follow Israel out into the desert, where God gave them a test before he gave them a command. But the clearest picture of what Sabbath was designed to do comes not from Eden. It comes from the desert. Before Israel ever received the Ten Commandments, before they stood at the foot of Sinai and heard the voice of God, they were given a test. It arrived in the form of bread. In Exodus 16, the Israelites are 6 weeks out of Egypt, hungry and complaining, and God responds by sending manna, thin flakes of something like bread that appear on the ground each morning with the dew. The instructions were precise. Gather what your household needs for today. Do not keep any until morning. And on the 6th day, gather twice as much, because on the 7th day there will be none. Some of them didn't listen. They kept extra overnight, and it rotted. Others went out on the 7th day to collect, and they found nothing. The ground was bare. The lesson wasn't about following a rule. It was about whether they trusted the one who was providing. Sabbath, in its first full appearance as a lived practice, is a test of dependence. God was essentially asking, will you stop when I tell you to stop? Will you believe that I will provide tomorrow what you cannot gather today? The manna that didn't rot on the 6th day and the empty ground on the 7th were both answers to the same question, and both came from the same source. This framing matters because it reorients everything. Sabbath isn't primarily about recuperation, though rest is real and good. It's about trust. It's a weekly, embodied declaration that you are not the one holding everything together. And then Deuteronomy 5 adds a second layer. When Moses rehearses the commandments for the next generation, he gives the Sabbath command a different rationale than the one in Exodus. Not creation this time, redemption. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand. Deuteronomy 5:15. The connection is direct. Slaves don't get to rest. A slave's worth is entirely bound up in what they produce. Pharaoh didn't give Israel days off, but God does. The Sabbath in this reading is not a burden placed on free people. It's the proof that they are free, which makes the modern situation quietly uncomfortable. Because the culture we inhabit runs almost entirely on the logic of Egypt. Your value is your output. Your worth is your productivity. Rest is something you earn after the work is done, and the work is never quite done, and many Christians, without realizing it, have absorbed this entirely. We carry the rhythms of Pharaoh into lives that are supposed to be shaped by the rhythms of God. This is what Sabbath was always asking. From the manna in the wilderness to the command at Sinai, do you believe you are free? Do you live like someone who has been delivered, or like someone still trying to earn their survival one day at a time? So the foundation is clear, but then Jesus arrives, and everything gets more complicated and more clarifying at the same time. The most famous scene involving Jesus and the Sabbath opens in a grain field. It's the Sabbath day, and his disciples are walking through, pulling heads of grain and eating as they go. The Pharisees see it and immediately challenge him. Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. Matthew 12:2. It's a trap dressed as a theological concern. And Jesus' answer is one of the most startling things he says in the Gospels. Was Jesus dismissing the Sabbath, or was he doing something far more radical? He doesn't defend his disciples by minimizing the Sabbath. He defends them by invoking his own authority over it. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Matthew 12:8. That is not the statement of someone abolishing a rule. That is the statement of someone who owns the day. He isn't standing outside the Sabbath looking in. He's standing at its center, declaring that it was always his to define. This distinction matters enormously, because Jesus heals on the Sabbath repeatedly throughout the Gospels, and every time he does it, the religious authorities treat it as a violation. But Jesus treats it as the point. In Mark 2:27, he says plainly, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." The day was designed as a gift, not a gatekeeping mechanism. It exists to serve human flourishing, not to restrict it. By the 1st century, the rabbinic tradition had developed an elaborate system of 39 categories of prohibited labor for the Sabbath, covering everything from writing to harvesting to kindling a fire. The intention was to build a protective fence around the commandment, but somewhere in the construction of that fence, the gift had become a burden. The day meant to declare human freedom had been transformed into an obstacle course of anxious compliance. Jesus doesn't dismantle the Sabbath. He restores it to its original design. And that design, it turns out, is liberation. Every healing Jesus performs on the Sabbath is an enactment of what the day was always meant to announce, that God's people are free from bondage, free from the powers that bind and diminish, free to Be fully human in the presence of a God who provides. The woman bent double for 18 years, straightened on the Sabbath. Luke 13:12. The man with the withered hand, restored. Matthew 12:13. These aren't accidents of timing. They're theological statements delivered through the body. After the resurrection, the early church gradually shifts its primary gathering to the first day of the week, Sunday, in recognition of the day Jesus rose. The rhythm of one day set apart remains, but its anchor point moves. Not because the Sabbath principle expired, but because something new had broken into history, and the community needed to orient itself around that new reality. But here's what's worth sitting with. Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. That's the claim, which means the question of what Sabbath means for us isn't settled by dismissing it as outdated. It's settled by asking what its Lord intends for it. And to answer that fully, you have to go one layer deeper, into a passage in the book of Hebrews that opens the Sabbath into something far larger than a weekly practice. The book of Hebrews takes everything we've just seen and opens it into something much larger. The author of Hebrews is writing to Jewish Christians who are deeply familiar with the Sabbath, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived weekly reality. And in Hebrews 4, he makes a move that reframes the entire practice. He argues that the weekly Sabbath was always pointing forward. It was a foretaste, a rehearsal, a shadow of something the whole biblical story is building toward. There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, he writes in Hebrews 4:9. Not there was, not there used to be. There remains, present tense, future orientation. The pattern he traces is deliberate. God rested on the seventh day of creation, Genesis 2. Israel rested when they finally entered the promised land under Joshua, a rest they forfeited repeatedly through unbelief. Believers now enter a kind of rest in Christ, a ceasing from the anxious self-justification of trying to earn their standing before God. And one day, at the completion of all things, there will be a final and total rest, the new creation described in Revelation 21, where God himself dwells with his people and every tear is wiped away. The weekly Sabbath sits inside this larger arc. It isn't just a day, it's a direction. Every time God's people have stopped their ordinary work and rested, they have been, whether they understood it fully or not, rehearsing the ending of the story. They have been acting out their belief that history is going somewhere, that the world will not spin forward in endless exhausted effort, that there is a completion coming that they did not produce and cannot rush. The timing isn't a coincidence. Jesus rises from the dead on the first day of the week, not the seventh, the first day, the beginning of a new creation week. The old creation ended in rest on day 7. The new creation begins with resurrection on day 1. And the writer of Hebrews is telling us that the rest we enter now, the rest we practice weekly, is a participation in that new creation. It isn't looking back at what God did in Eden. It's looking forward to what God is completing in Christ. This is why the Sabbath isn't a minor ritual concern. It is a load-bearing beam of the entire biblical narrative, from Genesis 2 to Revelation 21, with Hebrews 4 as the interpretive key that holds them together. And when we understand it this way, something shifts. Sabbath is no longer primarily about what you don't do on a given day. It becomes an act of eschatological hope. When you stop, when you genuinely, deliberately cease, you are saying with your body what you believe with your mind, that God is completing something you cannot finish, that the world is not held together by your effort, that the story ends in rest and not in exhaustion. Every Sabbath, practiced honestly, is a small and quiet proclamation that the resurrection happened and that it changes everything. If this is connecting things you've read but never quite seen together before, if the design in the text is becoming visible in a new way, the most helpful thing you can do is subscribe and leave a comment. Even a single word in the comments helps other people find this conversation. That's genuinely how it works. So the foundation is this deep and this wide, which makes what happened next in church history all the more significant and all the more costly. The shift didn't happen overnight. It happened in stages, and each stage made a kind of sense in its moment. In the earliest decades of the Church, Jewish believers continued to observe the seventh-day Sabbath, while also gathering on the first day of the week to celebrate the resurrection. The two practices coexisted. But as the Church spread into the Gentile world, and as the Jewish-Christian break deepened through the late 1st and 2nd centuries, Sunday gradually displaced the Sabbath as the primary day of Christian observance. The theological reasoning was sound. Sunday was the day of resurrection, the first day of the new creation week, but something quietly shifted in the process. The Sabbath had been a day of ceasing, Sunday became a day of gathering. Those are not the same thing. By 321 AD, the Emperor Constantine issued an edict making Sunday a civil day of rest across the Roman Empire, the first time a government had legally mandated the practice. The intention carried real merit, but the consequence was significant. What had been a theological discipline rooted in creation and redemption now became a legal category managed by the state. The practice was preserved in form, while its inner logic was increasingly obscured. Then came the centuries of Christendom, when Sunday observance was enforced by culture and law together, which meant it no longer required the kind of deliberate personal trust that the biblical Sabbath had always demanded. You rested on Sunday because everyone rested on Sunday. The countercultural witness was gone. The embodied act of trust had become a social norm. And then the Industrial Revolution arrived, and it unraveled even that. Through the 18th and 19th centuries, as factories ran continuously and labor became defined by the clock rather than the sun, workers eventually won the right to a two-day weekend, Saturday and Sunday, as a concession from employers and governments. The weekend was born not from theology but from labor negotiation. By the 20th century, those 2 days had been thoroughly colonized by leisure, errands, recreation, and eventually, for many Christians, a single hour of church on Sunday morning, followed by the rest of what looks, functionally, like any other day. The rhythm God built into creation, 1 day in 7, genuinely set apart, oriented around trust and rest and the rehearsal of a future hope, had been replaced by a 24/7 productivity cycle with a partial weekend attached. And most of us inherited this arrangement without ever questioning it, because we were born into a world where it had always been this way. This history isn't simply interesting, it reveals a pattern. Each step away from the biblical Sabbath had a reason. Each step produced a loss. And the accumulation of those losses over 17 centuries is precisely why Sabbath now feels, to most modern Christians, like either a legalistic burden or a pleasant impossibility, rather than the deep, life-shaping gift it was always designed to be. That history tells us exactly what we've lost. But naming the loss more precisely changes everything about how we understand the exhaustion so many of us are carrying. Here's what we actually lose when Sabbath becomes optional. The first loss is the practice of trust, not trust as an abstract virtue, but trust as a physical, embodied act. The biblical Sabbath was never just a mental posture. It was something you did with your body. You stopped moving, stopped producing, stopped acquiring. And in that stopping, you were making a concrete declaration. God sustains what I cannot. He provides what I do not gather. The world holds together without my effort for 1 day in 7. When that practice disappears, trust doesn't automatically fill the gap. What fills the gap is anxiety, and anxiety, over time, reshapes the way we live far more than we realize. The second loss is countercultural witness. In a culture that measures human worth entirely by productivity, a people who genuinely stop, not to recharge for more production, but because they believe the story ends in rest, is a visible proclamation. It raises a question that doesn't need words to ask. Why are you not working? What do you know that we don't? The Sabbath-keeping community was always meant to be a living sign, a community whose time told a different story than the surrounding culture's time. When the church simply mirrors the rhythms of the world with a Sunday morning service attached, that sign disappears. We become invisible precisely where we were designed to be most distinct. The third loss runs deepest. It is the loss of eschatological imagination, the capacity to live with one foot already in the future. Hebrews 4 tells us that the weekly Sabbath is a foretaste of the final rest, a rehearsal of the completed creation. When we stop practicing it, we stop rehearsing. And when we stop rehearsing, we begin, almost without noticing, to live as if this age is all there is. The horizon closes, the tyranny of the urgent expands to fill every available hour. We accept exhaustion as the natural condition of a faithful life, because we have lost the weekly reminder that the story ends somewhere other than here. Think about what that does to a pastor working 70 hours a week, or a deacon burning through her third consecutive month without a day off, or a family whose margin has collapsed so completely that Sunday feels more stressful than Thursday. We look at that picture and we call it dedication. The biblical frame would call it something closer to Egypt. Not the Egypt of malice, but the Egypt of a people who have forgotten they are free, who have forgotten that their worth was declared before they produced a single thing. This is what we've lost. Not a rule, not a religious obligation, a rhythm that was designed to keep telling us the truth about who we are and who God is, week after week, year after year, across an entire lifetime. So what do we do with this? The Bible doesn't give us a modern schedule, but it does give us a frame, and that frame, it turns out, changes everything about how you see the day. It's a bit like a composer who fills every measure of a piece of music with sound, every beat occupied, every rest deleted. The notes come one after another with no space between them, and at first it seems fuller, more ambitious, more productive. But what you actually get is noise, not music. Music requires rests. The silence between notes is not the absence of the composition. It is part of the composition. It gives the notes their shape, their weight, their meaning. Remove the rests, and you don't have more music, you have less. Sabbath is the rest written into the score of a human life, not the absence of living. The beat that makes the rest of the week mean something, and here is where the reframe matters most. We tend to approach Sabbath as a question of what we don't do. What counts as work? Can I check my email? Can I cook? Can I exercise? These are not wrong questions, but they are small questions. They treat Sabbath as a boundary to navigate rather than a gift to receive. The deeper question, the one the manna story and the Sinai command in Hebrews 4 are all pointing toward, is this: am I willing to stop long enough to remember that I am not God? That is the actual practice, not the management of a list of prohibited activities, but the deliberate, regular, unhurried act of ceasing, of putting down the work and trusting that what depends on God will be held by God, of living, for one day, as if the resurrection actually changed something about how the world works. What this looks like will vary. For some it will mean a quiet house and an open Bible. For others it will mean a long walk, a shared meal, an afternoon with no agenda. The specific form is less fixed than the specific posture, a posture of release rather than control, of receiving rather than achieving. The Sabbath God modeled in Genesis wasn't complicated. He stopped and he dwelled in the completion of what he had made. We are invited to do the same, to stop and to dwell, to let the week be what it was, and to trust that the next week will be held by the same hands that held this one. And every time we do it, every time we genuinely cease, we are rehearsing the ending of the story. We are practicing in small and ordinary ways the final rest that Hebrews says still remains for the people of God. The Sabbath doesn't point back to Eden alone. It points forward to the new creation, to the city whose builder and maker is God, to the rest that no exhaustion can interrupt. Each week, we get a foretaste. Each week, we choose whether to receive it. The question was never really about which day or which activities. It was always about the story we're telling with our time. Sabbath doesn't feel impossible because we're too busy. It feels impossible because we've stopped believing what it asks us to believe. It asks us to believe that the world will not unravel in the hours we are not managing it. It asks us to believe that our worth was settled before we produced anything today, or this week, or ever. It asks us to believe that the God who rested on the seventh day, not from exhaustion, But from completion is the same God who holds what we lay down. That is not a scheduling problem. It is a faith problem. And the only way through it is the same way Israel walked through it in the wilderness. One stopped day at a time, learning slowly that the manna appears whether we go out early or not. The rest God modeled in Genesis was never about fatigue. It was about completion. He stopped because the work was finished and it was good. And the deepest echo of that moment is not a quiet Sunday afternoon, though that is a gift. It is the moment from the cross when Jesus said, "It is finished," the work of redemption complete, the new creation inaugurated, the final rest secured. We stop not because we have earned it, but because He has. If this study has opened something for you, if the connection between creation and Sabbath and resurrection feels more alive than it did before, the most helpful thing you can do is subscribe and leave a comment. It can be a single word. That's genuinely how other people find their way to this conversation, and please keep us in your prayers. It means more than you know.